Madame Christina, elle est connue, elle a été introduite par le juge Antonio. Je ne vais pas refaire la présentation, mais c'est une experte de renommée qui travaille dans le domaine et aussi dans le steering committee de la commission. Et elle est très active, donc elle va nous présenter un peu le thème qui est très, très intéressant. Nous avons le thème de la désertification, l'eau et le changement climatique, qui est vraiment qui touche l'Afrique, qui concerne l'Afrique entière, mais aussi, moi, je peux ajouter que l'Afrique aussi connaît une croissance humaine galopante qui est aussi inquiétante et qui peut-être vers 2050, nous serons 1,5 milliard de citoyens qui vivent sur ce continent et nous devons maintenant agir pour leur permettre une vie décente et modeste. Il y a maintenant une crise d'eau, il y a un problème de désertification, et il y a un problème de perte de la biodiversité, une perte du sol agricole. Il y a des conflits, il y a beaucoup de migrations écologiques et beaucoup de gens qui se déplacent. Et vraiment, l'Afrique souffre actuellement des conditions du changement climatique avec l'instabilité que connaît surtout les cornes de l'Afrique et le Sahel, où il y a des troubles, disons, qui ne permettent pas à la population de vivre en stabilité, en tranquillité. Alors, notre premier intervenant, c'est Madame Christina. À vous la parole, Madame Christina, pour un peu nous introduire le sujet.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the introduction as well. I will just give a very brief, high level of overarching introduction to the topic of this fourth high-level roundtable on water desertification and climate change. We all know that the challenges of water scarcity, of desertification, soil erosion, and loss of arable land are interrelated, are interconnected, and they're already pertinent. But the impacts of climate change are expected to exacerbate them, in particular for the already climate vulnerable African continent. We also know that the projected climate change impacts pose significant risks to natural and human systems, and we know that the higher the temperature increase, the higher is the risk. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, in its special report on global warming from 2018, projected significant risks already at warming at 1.5 degrees, but even significantly higher if we move up on the temperature scale to 2 degrees. And as we all know, these risks include increased water stress up to 50%, depending on the region, smaller net yields of crop, loss of livestock, reduction of food availability, negative impacts on human health, reduction in sea level rise and changes to the salinity of groundwater, severe damage to infrastructure, as we've currently been seeing all over the world, but also the increased likelihood of extreme weather events such as torrential rainfalls, floods, storms, droughts, and so forth. But in addition to those direct impacts, if we can call them like this, there are also more indirect effects of climate change, which interact and intensify poverty, conflict, instability, and unrest, resource depletion, and already existing food insecurity, loss of livelihoods, infrastructure breakdown, and the loss of access to essential services, including electricity, water, sanitation, and healthcare, as well as, and we just heard that, as they bear the danger of relocation and migration of peoples. Each one of these effects is deeply worrisome, especially in an African context where many of these stresses are already prominent. Yet it is first when we look at the entire picture, the sum, the accumulation of all of these impacts, that the truly alarming picture emerges. Addressing the causes and remedies to these adverse effects to human systems is an unprecedented challenge in scope, scale, and urgency. But science also tells us, and that's maybe the optimistic message here, science also tells us that we still have a choice. We have a choice between addressing these challenges in a collective and planned and effective manner, or if we don't do that, the choice to a world which will look immeasurably different from the one that we know and the one within human systems, including the legal systems, have evolved. So the IPCC report of 2018 tells in very clear terms what needs to be done. It says that global CO2 emissions need to go down to net zero around 2050 in order to keep global warming somewhere close to 1.5 degrees and need to stay below zero thereafter. Similarly, the IPBES report of 2019 states that nature can be conserved, restored, and used sustainably if the main drivers are addressed. If the conversion of forests into agricultural land and development is halted and reversed, if pollution and invasive species are tackled, climate change mitigated, then we may stand a chance to bend the curve on biodiversity loss. However, all the reports stress, and very consistently do so, that this can only be achieved through what is called transformative change. A transformative change is a fundamental system-wide reorganization across economic, social, and technological factors, including goals and values and the legal system, of course. The IPCC specifies that these system transitions are unprecedented in scale, but not necessarily in speed. In other words, humanity has done quick changes before, but never at this scale. So this is new. And the time span for making informed decisions is short. According to scientists, this fundamental reorganization across all scales and factors has to happen within the next 10 years, the critical decade, as we discussed yesterday. And this is also why the topic of this Second World Environmental Law Congress is the critical decade for environmental law. And in this context, all the scientific reports that we know of call on strengthening the global response and enhancing international cooperation. Climate change, water stresses, desertification, and global biodiversity loss are all collective action problems, and it can only be achieved through or addressed through transformational international governance, system of intensifying international cooperation, coordination, management, and importantly, implementation to support developing countries. Let me now say a couple of words about these global initiatives and regimes that we're currently seeing and that are having very important meetings this year and next year. In particular, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, and the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And I'd just like to highlight 2 points. The first one is the issue of integration and mutual supportiveness of all these different regimes that we're having. Because these different fora work largely independent from each other. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Sorry, I'm running out of power. Just give me 1 second. And the Convention on Combating Desertification, they establish different treaty regimes, each one with its own rules, with its own priorities, its own institutions and parties. Yet these issues, as I tried to say, they're deeply connected and deeply interlinked. So substantively, we've seen a couple of newer developments, for example, in the first draft to the 2020 post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is supposed to be adopted under the Convention on Biological Diversity. This framework tries to be or aims to be complementary to and supportive of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And it also takes into account the long-term strategies and targets of other multilateral environmental agreements, including the biodiversity-related and the Rio Conventions. And that is done in order to ensure synergistic delivery of benefits from all the agreements for the planet and for the people. As an example, there is a target that sets out mitigating the impacts of climate change on biodiversity, contributing to mitigation adaptation through ecosystem-based approaches. Similarly, and we discussed this partly yesterday, under the Paris Agreement, many parties have included nature-based solutions in their national climate policies and NDCs and their nationally determined contributions as requested under Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. However, under the climate regime, no safeguards for biodiversity protection exist, maybe with the exception of protection of forests in developing countries, usually referred to as REDD+. And large-scale climate change mitigation projects, for example, large-scale forest plantations or hydrodams, they can have a significant detrimental impact on biodiversity, on water quality or quantity, or on soils. It is therefore important that in the context of climate negotiations on cooperative approaches, for example, such safeguards are elaborated and adopted, hopefully at COP26 in Glasgow. In general, mutually supportive international regimes are important, and work on stronger integration between these international regimes is necessary. And my final point is on implementation, compliance, and enforcement. All these international processes set up important treaties, agreements, decisions, and declarations to guide national policymaking and decision and national lawmaking. However, what is currently largely lacking is the effective and sustained national implementation of these agreements. The treaties are in place, yes, and that's great, but their momentum on the national level is more often than not lost. Examples include the non-achievement of the Aichi targets under the Convention on Biological Diversity, or the still insufficient ambition level in states' nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. Now, this should not lead to a criticism of the treaties per se, but of their implementation, and raise questions on how we as lawyers can better ensure effective, sustained, and fair implementation. In this context, resource mobilization and other means of implementation, such as capacity building and technology transfer, are important aspects for many African nations. Moreover, it is important to design effective national laws, implement them domestically, and ensure their enforcement. Capacity constraints are all too widespread, and this needs to be addressed. In addition, these challenges require whole of society responses and inclusive participatory governance systems for all stakeholders, be they youth, women, local communities, indigenous peoples, or generations not yet born. Access to information is important, participatory rights and possibilities, as well as access to justice. These international fora and processes provide important possibilities for exchanges and development, for solidarity and cooperation. Yet, there is significant potential for better and deeper integration of the different silos that we see of multilateral environmental governance, and a wide room for improvement and enhancement. The United Nations Environmental Programme and the United Nations Environment Assembly are the UN institutions which can support such closer cooperation between the different UN regimes. It is the UN government's body for the environment, and the call for strengthening the United Nations Environmental Programme are getting louder and they're getting more frequent. Let us therefore hope that next year's celebration of UNEP's 50th anniversary will also bring stronger international support and trust for its important role. Thank you.
Merci Madame Christina pour cette brève introduction. Effectivement, la réduction de la pauvreté représente Dès lors, l'une des principales approches de la lutte contre la désertification. Bien sûr, les gens pauvres ne souhaitent jamais détruire l'environnement où ils vivent, mais ils sont poussés à survivre dans des conditions très, très lamentables. Avec votre permission, je vais maintenant, mesdames, messieurs, inviter notre prochain orateur qui est Dr Yacouba Savadogo. C'est de l'économie verte et du changement climatique de la République de Burkina Faso. Il est aussi expert national indépendant, accrédité auprès du secrétaire exécutif de la Convention de la lutte contre la désertification, la CDD. Dr Savadogo est coordinateur du réseau de l'Afrique francophone des juristes de l'environnement. Alors, avec la permission de ma collègue Jennifer, je vais inviter le professeur Yacouba à prendre la parole pour nous exposer un peu l'idée de son intervention. À vous la parole.
Merci, monsieur le président de séance. Je vais ouvrir peut-être mon intervention en commençant par remercier le professeur Antonio Benjamin et toute l'équipe dirigeante de la Commission mondiale du droit de l'environnement, non seulement pour l'initiative de ce congrès, mais aussi de m'avoir permis en me donnant la parole pour que j'évoque ici un sujet qui est central à l'Afrique. Et le thème de ma communication portera sur la difficile mise en œuvre de la Convention africaine sur la conservation de la nature et des ressources naturelles, communément appelée Convention de Maputo. Pour ceux qui savent bien, cette convention, elle constitue donc la version révisée de la Convention d'Alger de 1968. Alors, pourquoi revenir sur cette convention? C'est parce que son parcours est un peu juxtaposé donc d'un certain nombre de difficultés. Et je vais aborder donc ma présentation donc en 3 points. Premièrement, je vais évoquer donc les origines donc de cette convention. Pourquoi revenir donc sur les origines? Parce que c'est une convention africaine qui est partie donc de Londres. De Londres, on a mis assez du temps sur le chemin pour arriver à Maputo en 2003. Ensuite, mon deuxième point va aborder donc les difficultés donc de la mise en œuvre de cette convention pour justement donc terminer par des perspectives de cette mise en œuvre. On se souvient que la convention africaine sur la conservation de la nature et des ressources naturelles constitue ce que nous appelons donc la convention mère des instruments juridiques régionaux africains en matière de conservation. Elle a été adoptée, comme je le disais, le 11 juillet 2003 à Maputo, dans la capitale du Mozambique. Et comme je l'ai dit, elle constitue justement donc cette version révisée de cette convention d'Alger de 1968. Alors, c'est une convention simple. Connaissant un peu le contexte africain dans la constitution de la convention, pour que la convention puisse rentrer en vigueur, on n'est pas allé loin. On a juste demandé 15 ratifications. Ça veut dire qu'à partir donc de son adoption, une quinzaine de ratifications suffisait donc pour que cette convention rentre en vigueur. Et ça a été confirmé à l'article 38 donc de la convention. Heureusement pour nous, même si cela est intervenu tardivement, ce 15e instrument de ratification a été déposé par la République du Bénin en 2016 et conformément justement donc au contenu de la convention est rentrée en vigueur 1 mois plus tard, soit dans le mois donc de juillet dans la même année, après ce instrument de ratification. Mais pourquoi revenir sur cette convention? Parce que après justement 17 ans après avoir été adoptée et après plus de 3 ans de son entrée en vigueur, nous sommes toujours en train de préparer l'organisation de la première COP, la première conférence de cette partie de cette convention. En ce moment, donc, relève donc les difficultés. Alors, voilà un peu les éléments donc, de l'introduction. Et ils abordent maintenant le premier point des origines de la convention de Maputo. Comme je le disais, la convention vient de loin. On se souvient que lorsque les États africains étaient toujours sous le joug donc, de la colonisation, les puissances coloniales qui ont colonisé donc, certains États africains ont pris l'initiative d'organiser ou du moins d'adopter un instrument juridique africain, un instrument juridique pour protéger donc les ressources naturelles africaines. Et cela donc a abouti donc à l'adoption de la Convention sur la préservation des animaux sauvages, des oiseaux et des poissons en Afrique qui a été signée à Londres le 19 mai 1900. Mais la particularité de cette convention, c'est qu'elle a eu pour cette convention et pour l'objectif le massacre incontrôlé d'animaux vivant à l'état sauvage et justement donc elle a assuré la conservation de certaines espèces. Mais cette convention n'a pas pu entrer en vigueur parce que justement donc les mêmes puissances qui l'ont signée ne l'ont pas ratifiée. Alors, cela n'a pas découragé donc les mêmes acteurs, ces mêmes puissances coloniales donc se sont encore organisées pour convoquer un congrès à Paris en 1931 pour revenir donc sur ces gisements. Et ce processus donc de congrès donc de Paris a abouti à l'adoption d'une seconde convention de Londres. Cette convention qui a été adoptée le 8 novembre 1933, encore à Londres, avec l'adoption de la seconde convention sur la conservation de la faune et de la flore à l'état naturel. Mais contrairement donc à la première convention, cette seconde convention de Londres a pu rentrer donc en vigueur en janvier 1936. Alors, nous disons que l'importance donc de cette dernière convention donc de Londres, soit donc celle de 1933, c'est qu'elle fut le tout premier instrument juridique contraignant à prévoir la création d'aires protégées en Afrique, telles que les parcs nationaux ou les réserves naturelles. Et ce que nous constatons avec ces deux processus donc de convention de Londres, vous remarquerez avec moi que ce processus des deux conventions de Londres n'a pas impliqué les acteurs africains. Ce sont des conventions qui ont été initiées, qui ont été négociées sans concertation ou participation donc des acteurs africains. Justement donc avec donc toutes ces insuffisances, il était question à un certain moment de revoir donc cette seconde convention de 1933 pour justement donc revenir sur un autre texte qui cette fois-ci prendrait justement donc en compte donc les préoccupations africaines. Mais ce processus de révision de la Convention de Londres de 1933 a été interrompu justement donc à cause donc des mouvements de décolonisation que le continent africain a connus. Alors, justement, maintenant, après tout ce processus, on se situe maintenant juste avant les années 60, où justement donc après l'accession à la souveraineté internationale, c'est-à-dire à l'indépendance des États africains, ils se sont souvenus que même à leur absence, leurs colonisateurs ont pris des initiatives pour réglementer l'utilisation de leurs propres ressources naturelles. Mais lorsqu'ils sont devenus indépendants, ils ont encore repris donc cette initiative et justement cette fois-ci, avec donc sous le leadership de l'Union, l'Organisation de l'Unité africaine, on se souvient qui a été créée en 1963, les acteurs africains ont maintenant pris à bras le corps donc cette réglementation de l'utilisation des ressources naturelles, un processus qui a abouti justement donc à l'adoption de la Convention d'Alger de 1968. Et maintenant, nous avons quitté Londres, on est déjà à Alger. Mais le processus n'est pas terminé puisque de Alger, il faut maintenant aller à Maputo. Maintenant, tout le monde se souvient que de 1968 jusqu'aux années 2000, il y a eu beaucoup de choses. Non seulement donc au plan international, le droit de l'environnement donc a été fécond. Beaucoup d'instruments juridiques sur la protection de l'environnement ont été adoptés. On a eu beaucoup de conventions. Donc, il était question à un certain moment de réviser donc la Convention d'Alger de 1968 pour l'adapter seulement donc au contexte actuel donc du moment. Voilà le contexte dans lequel donc la Convention d'Alger est rentrée dans un processus donc de révision. Et ce processus de révision a abouti le 11 juillet 2003 à Maputo, où seulement donc on a adopté à cette date-là la convention, la nouvelle convention, ou bien encore la convention révisée d'Alger de 1968, ou carrément donc la convention de Maputo, qui porte sur le même nom, Convention africaine sur la conservation de la nature et des ressources naturelles. Voilà un peu pour ce qui est donc du chemin parcouru. Maintenant, nous allons aborder donc très rapidement les difficultés de mise en œuvre donc de la convention. Comme je vous le disais à l'introduction, de 2003 jusqu'à l'heure actuelle, la convention de Maputo n'a pas pu organiser sa première conférence des parties. Et pourquoi insister donc sur l'organisation de cette première conférence des parties? Parce que c'est cette première conférence des parties qui doit mettre en place les mécanismes institutionnels de mise en œuvre de la convention. Et Et une des difficultés donc justement donc de sa mise en œuvre est sa faible état de ratification. On se souvient que, comme je le disais, c'est une convention qui a mis 13 ans. De son adoption à son entrée en vigueur, il y a eu une période de 13 ans qui s'est écoulée. Parce que justement, donc, le 15e instrument de ratification est intervenu tardivement. Donc, il y a déjà donc cette tardive ratification, mais faible ratification parce que depuis justement donc 2003 jusqu'à nos jours, ce n'est que 17 États africains qui ont ratifié cette convention. 17 États sur plus de 50 États que compte le continent africain. Nous disons que c'est peu, c'est faible, et cela n'arrange pas tout du tout la mise en œuvre efficace donc, de la convention. Alors, après donc, justement, donc, ces problèmes de ratification tardive et faible, nous allons maintenant voir quelles sont les difficultés d'organisation. Comme je le disais, la convention peine à organiser donc, sa première conférence des parties. Alors que cet instrument donc, est intéressant, surtout que pour amorcer justement donc la mise en œuvre de la convention, la première conférence des parties doit faire un choix important qui concerne donc les fonctions de secrétariat de la convention. Alors, il y a des possibilités. Soit donc à la première conférence des parties, les parties s'entendent pour désigner une organisation existante pour exercer les fonctions du secrétariat, ou bien établir justement donc un secrétariat propre à la convention. Mais je pense que moi, de mon propre avis, il est mieux que justement donc les acteurs africains adoptent donc la première stratégie, soit désigner une organisation existante pour exercer donc les fonctions donc de ce secrétariat. Et on est parti justement donc de l'image donc de l'UICN qui a occupé donc, qui a assuré le secrétariat donc de la convention de Ramsar avec brillance, avec efficacité. Effectivement, lorsque nous avons organisé donc les concertations africaines, nous avons approché l'UICN, nous avons également approché le bureau régional Afrique de l'Ouest et du centre de l'UICN pour voir concrètement comment donc à travers donc l'UICN, on peut partir donc sur ce principe que l'UICN, même si c'est pour un bout de temps déterminé, s'occupe justement donc du secrétariat donc de cette convention avant peut-être que d'autres initiatives ne soient entreprises. Alors, quelles sont les perspectives d'organisation de cette COP? Alors, disons que les acteurs africains que nous sommes, nous avons mis à profiter donc de nos instants. Vous vous souviendrez qu'au niveau donc de l'Afrique, nous avons ce que nous appelons la conférence ministérielle africaine sur l'environnement, dont le secrétariat est assuré donc par le UNEA et la tutelle technique donc c'est l'UEA. L'organisation donc de l'unité africaine qui assure donc cette fonction technique. Et la conférence ministérielle se tient périodiquement, 1 an, 2 ans, en fonction donc des thèmes. Elle a donc des sessions ordinaires, comme justement donc la conférence a également donc des sessions extraordinaires. Alors, nous avons profité de la 7e session extraordinaire de la CMAE qui a eu lieu donc à Nairobi en 2018 pour que le Burkina Faso engage un plaidoyer de très haut niveau. Alors, on se souvient donc grâce au segment ministériel donc de cette convention, de cette session donc de 1918, le Burkina Faso a fait un grand plaidoyer au segment ministériel en demandant justement aux États africains de prendre donc des mesures urgentes pour que justement la première COP de cette convention soit organisée. Et en demandant également donc aux États africains, surtout donc les États qui n'ont pas encore ratifié donc cette convention, de prendre des mesures urgentes pour procéder à la ratification de cette convention. Effectivement, donc, le plaidoyer donc, du Burkina Faso a été attendu donc, à cette occasion. Et à partir donc, de cette session donc, de 1918, le Burkina Faso n'a jamais encore raté une occasion des réunions donc, de la CMAE, de la conférence ministérielle africaine pour l'environnement, pour justement donc, évoquer donc, cette question d'urgence de mise en œuvre donc, de la convention. C'est pourquoi nous avons encore mis en exergue la 17e session ordinaire de la conférence ministérielle africaine sur l'environnement, qui cette fois-ci s'est tenue à Durban en 2019. Là, sous l'initiative du Burkina Faso, il y a eu l'organisation d'un side event. Un side event qui a été co-organisé par le PNUE, l'UIA, l'unité africaine, plus d'autres gouvernements tels que l'Union africaine du moins, plus d'autres gouvernements tels que le gouvernement du Burkina Faso, le gouvernement du Tchad et le gouvernement donc, de la Guinée. Donc ensemble, seulement donc avec ces co-organisateurs, nous avons organisé un side event où nous avons présenté encore cette problématique urgente de la convention donc, de Maputo. Il me reste quelques temps, je vais terminer tout de suite. Je pratiquement terminé. Et justement, donc, après donc, cette session de Durban en 2019, nous avons encore mis en exergue donc, à profit la session extraordinaire de la CMAE, qui s'est déroulée en virtuel en 2021, pour encore poursuivre donc, ces mêmes efforts donc, de plaidoyer. Et je peux dire que ces plaidoyers donc, ont porté fruit, puisque que ce soit donc, au niveau du PNUE, que ce soit donc, au niveau donc, de l'Union africaine, maintenant le processus d'organisation de la première COP de la Convention de Maputo en mars. Et aux dernières nouvelles, nous savons que c'est l'Angola qui s'est désigné pour justement donc habiliter la première COP de la Convention. Et n'eût été donc le phénomène donc du coronavirus qui est venu un peu bouleverser donc le programme mondial. Et les acteurs avaient entrepris d'organiser donc cette COP à Angola en 2020. Mais les efforts se poursuivent justement donc avec l'ensemble donc des acteurs pour que peut-être que d'ici la fin de l'année 2021, j'ai eu un peu des échanges avec l'Union africaine et on nous rassure que justement donc ils sont en train de se préparer pour que justement donc cette première COP se tienne en Algérie en 2020. Voilà brièvement.
Merci, M. Yacouba, mais vraiment, je vous remercie pour rafraîchir la mémoire, parce que la Convention d'Alger en 1968 a été, une fois qu'elle a été adoptée, elle était enterrée dans un tiroir et n'a jamais vu le jour. Mais c'est bien de rappeler, depuis 68, en 2003 à Maputo, et maintenant j'espère que l'Union africaine va un peu, grâce à Burkina Faso, va un peu pousser de sortir ces deux conventions de la poussière et les appliquer, parce que normalement l'Afrique était leader et que c'est avant le sommet de Rio où les trois conventions ont été adoptées que l'Afrique a déjà pensé à une convention panafricaine, et je souhaite que la convention des parties sera tenue. La rencontre des partis sera tenue prochainement. Je vous remercie et je vais céder la parole à ma collègue. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Jennifer. Jennifer, have the micro.
Thank you. So I would thank also the previous two speakers. It's my pleasure to welcome Professor Olawuyi, who is a professor of energy and environmental law at the Hamad bin Khalifa University in Doha. He is also the Chancellor's Fellow and the Director of the Institute for Oil, Gas, Energy, Environment and Sustainable Development at Afa Babalola University in Nigeria, and an independent expert of the African Union's Working Group on Extractive Industries, Environment and Human Rights Violations. He's written extensively, and most recently, his most recent publications include a book called Local Content and Sustainable Development in Global Energy Markets, another one, The Human Rights-Based Approach to Carbon Finance, and very important, the extractive industry law in Africa. So without further ado, let me welcome to have a little bit more inward focus on the challenges related to the interactions between these three different conventions, as well as the Rio conventions. Thank you. So over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much for the kind and wonderful introduction. I bring you greetings from Nigeria. And it's my pleasure to join this session. I think the previous speaker, as well as Christina, have set the tone for my very brief interventions. There is a need, as Christina mentioned, there is a need for transformative approaches that move beyond sectoral and piecemeal interventions in terms of whether we're looking at water, desertification, climate change, And in that context, I've been working on this issue of water, energy, food nexus, and how, and I want to just flesh out some of the things I have been looking at as a way of proposing an agenda for the ongoing treaty negotiations to see how we can integrate this transformative nexus approach to governance, in the environmental context. So I'll talk briefly about what I mean by nexus, and of course, a lot of us would have come across this whole water, energy, food nexus debate. So I'll talk about that discourse a little bit, and I would then emphasize what I think an agenda for hybrid regulatory approaches would be going forward in the context of ongoing negotiations. So in terms of the nexus discourse is very simple. Water, energy, and food are linked. Water, of course, as we know, is required for agriculture. Without water, we cannot even generate energy most of the time. Energy is also required for food distribution. Energy is required for water distribution as well. And we see that the food and agricultural sector is currently one of the largest, consumers of water and one of the largest users of energy as well. So you see clearly that there is a link, and it is this link that scholars and researchers increasingly describe as the nexus, the water, energy, food nexus. So it is very clear that there is, if any of this important resource is missing, it's going to affect countries across the world, especially arid countries in Africa, because of course we need water to irrigate crops, we need water for food production, we need, and the use of water again can, increased use of water in energy and agricultural processes might reduce water availability. It might increase energy consumption, and so and also we see the development of low carbon and renewable energy projects as a response to climate change, which may, their aim is to promote energy security, but they may as well threaten food and water security. And we've seen a number of these projects being challenged across Africa, especially when they lead to land grabs or when they lead to the worsening conditions in conditions of land in arid countries already. So it is very, very clear there is a nexus between water, there is a nexus between water, energy, and food. And there is a need to recognize this nexus at regional and international levels through transformative regulatory approaches that move beyond piecemeal regulation that we see. But the problem we see is that across Africa, water, energy, and food sectors are often under the different regulation of different ministries. In many countries in Africa, you have a separate water ministry, you have a separate energy ministry, and a separate agriculture ministry. And I think that distinction has not allowed for that holistic regulatory approach that we've been talking about when we talk about the water, energy, food nexus. And of course, the need for a nexus approach is further highlighted by the problem of climate change, because water, energy, and food face common threats of climate change. Climate change is going to worsen food security, it's going to worsen land access, it's going to worsen soil fertility, and it will reduce water supply worldwide, especially in Africa. So secondly, response to climate change and projects designed to respond to climate change could again worsen energy prices, could worsen food availability as well. And I've talked about this whole issue of land grabs and the likes. Thirdly, you see this ongoing transition to net zero future. There is a need to then begin to think of whether we have water, energy, and food infrastructure systems that are climate smart and that would be able to emphasize the nature-based solutions that everyone is talking about as a solution to the problem of climate change. Right now, we see a number of infrastructure projects being developed, but implementing that nexus approach, even in infrastructure design, is something that is yet to take center stage, most especially in Africa. So, and I discussed some of these issues in my ongoing, in my recent or forthcoming book that will be released just any moment from now in the next few days. And in that book, I looked at some of the issues in the context of North Africa, and you see that there is still a need in North Africa and even across Africa generally. There is a need to ensure that water, energy, and food security issues are treated in a coherent manner, given the intersections that I've highlighted. Current approaches tend to be sectoral, tend to be, you see, like I mentioned, different institutions responsible for water, responsible for land, responsible for food and the likes. And these have not really allowed for coordination and a coherent approach in our efforts to address climate change and in our efforts to ensure that projects responding to climate change do not worsen water, energy, and food security. So in this book, I call for a nexus approach through enhanced dialogue, collaboration, and coordination amongst the regulatory stakeholders in order to ensure that synergies and trade-offs are appropriately dealt with, and that we have safeguards in place that will bring the key institutions together. And like I mentioned, although some work are ongoing in some countries in Africa in terms of WEF nexus integration, some of these efforts have not adequately reflected the strong multi-stakeholder approaches that I believe will be required in order to avoid water, energy, food scarcities in the continent. So some of the key questions that I'm putting forward to stakeholders as we go to some of these negotiations will be: are there what are the strategies for ensuring that for achieving the net zero future and energy transition plans in a holistic manner, in a manner that does not, and as Christina mentioned, there is still this concern about lack of regime integration, this fragmentation of responses and the likes, which have slowed down efforts to address climate change and to address water and energy food security issues. I ask again, how can we ensure that we achieve lower carbon systems while not affecting the reliability, affordability, and accessibility of energy, water, and food supply? And thirdly, I believe one of the key issues that need to be at the center stage is addressing human rights implications of climate change responses on lands, water, energy, and food systems. And this is an issue that we've been discussing a lot at the African Union Working Group on extractive industries. I believe there is a need to address the human rights of climate. In terms of the key points, there is a need for a WEF nexus governance approach, that will bring together, that will forge more integration and harmonization, or that will reflect water, energy, and food obligations across this key, whether we are talking of the Convention on Biodiversity, or you're talking of climate change, or you're talking of the UNEA, or the Convention on Desertification as well. There is a need to ensure that we reflect water, energy, and food security issues in each of these systems, in each of these treaty bodies, and we must reflect them in a coherent and holistic manner. And so I advocate for, what I call the 5 I's, the need for the integration of institutions. Even at the international level, you still see that despite recent progress, many of these treaty bodies are yet to achieve the level of coherence that we've been looking for. You still see that even integration of the work of the CBD with that of UNFCCC and the likes is yet to reach the level of maturity that we hope. And that means even at regional and domestic level, you still see that lack of interoperability. You still see a situation in which many of the national bodies and institutions continue to function independently without, and at times, for example, in the case of Nigeria, we even see almost issues of contention between water ministries, energy ministries, and food ministries. And this has not really allowed for multi-stakeholder approaches to the governance of these scarce resources that will be significantly affected by climate change. I call for the integration of information sharing as well. One of the key things that the pandemic has brought to the fore is the lack of interoperability amongst key institutions when it comes to real-time access to information on water, energy, and food security and how climate change might impact them. There is a need for integration of instruments and policies as well, whether at the international level or at the regional or domestic level. We need to see clear references, and I would say clear textual references, as a matter of fact, to some of these obligations. For example, when you look at the CBD, you will hardly find any reference to energy or any reference to, you hardly find any reference to energy, which one would say, well, but the CBD is about biodiversity. It has nothing to do with food or energy. But I think we need to move beyond such, artificial bifurcations that have not really allowed us to explore, interoperability. And that has to be both at the international and regional and, and like I said, even at the domestic level as well. There is a need to ensure that many of the, texts that are negotiated do recognize these trade-offs, do recognize the need for synergies, and do recognize the need to ensure that efforts to address climate change do not result to human rights violations, especially violations of rights relating to water, energy access, and food. Because failure to address this, failure to reflect this, obligations in a clear manner will continue to encourage what we see right now, which is more of fragmentation and less, coordination. And I also think there is a need for, the development of holistic infrastructure and technological solutions. And of course, in the African context, many of the African countries, for example, Nigeria, still have huge infrastructure deficits, which have not allowed coordinated responses to climate change. So whether we're talking about the need for climate smart infrastructure in water, energy, and food systems, whether we're talking about the need for information sharing, these things cannot occur with some of the outdated infrastructure that is on ground in many countries. So there is a need for, for finance and development agencies to look at how they can support infrastructure renewal in many of the developing countries in the continent, especially the renewal of or development of climate smart infrastructure that will promote holistic responses to the problems of climate change and to issues of energy transition as well. And of course, there is a need for greater international coordination and regional cooperation. Some of the efforts that are ongoing will need to be heightened, will need to be accelerated rather, given the fierce urgency of climate change and the fact that there is really less time. I would like to see the African Development Bank and many of the African regional bodies clearly providing more in terms of capacity development and in terms of skill acquisition needed to transition to climate smart infrastructure development in this key sector. So there is a need for that, and there is a need for African countries as well to look inwards and think deeply about South-South cooperation that will lead to this interoperability that we're talking about. Well, I'll leave it at that. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to further discussions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that really interesting presentation. I think that you've, by taking this particular problem and making it bigger, as Professor Sheikh would say, from a well-known economist, you can begin to see what the solution should really be. And of course, you've highlighted this nexus between these three areas, but you've also, in talking about how to address this issue, focused at three critical levels. The first, obviously, being governance, and you've elaborated on that, which ties up always, which is the key part of procedural justice. And the second being really about the substance of the law, the relationships between institutions as defined, integration between conventions. But then the third area is really how that is expressed in terms of implementation on the one hand and the impact on people on the other. And I find this really ties quite nicely with the two previous speakers. I also really like that in terms of talking about people, you really draw us to think about what are those 5 requirements of food security, accessibility, affordability, and so forth, that whatever the solutions are that we pioneer, we should not impact adversely on the other goals we are trying to achieve, for example, in terms of 2030, the Sustainable Development Goals. And in this context, you also highlighted a key human rights problem of land grabs. So thank you, Prof, for that really interesting, holistic way of thinking about transformation and highlighting these different parts of the solution. I'm not sure with the overall chair of the session whether we have some time for discussion. It was our hope that we would be able to have about 20 minutes discussion, and we asked the participants to keep their presentations short. So if that is feasible, perhaps the overall chair can indicate we would like to.
We'll have 20 minutes of discussion, and maybe with your permission, Jennifer, I start in the room if there is any question from the room here, and then we can maybe give the floor to the speaker to answer. Une question? My colleague, Mr. Maroufi from IUCN NGO, he can maybe have a question.
J'ai une question pour le dernier intervenant qui a proposé une approche qu'il a appelée Need for Water, Energy and Food Nexus Governance Approach. Ça me rappelle la même idée qui était proposée dans le Sommet mondial de développement durable en 2002, qui est basée sur le Water, Energy, Health, Agriculture and Biodiversity. I want to know if it's the same idea or it's a new proposal in this subject. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup. Thank you, Mr. Maroufi. I have Mr. Benis from my left side.
Moi, bien sûr, je voudrais intervenir sur cette dernière présentation concernant le Nexus. Je crois qu'effectivement, comme ça a été de cette vision, effectivement, lorsqu'on parle de l'eau, lorsqu'on parle de l'énergie, on parle pratiquement de tous les secteurs de l'environnement. Et bien sûr, on spécifie la question de l'agriculture. Donc finalement, l'homme, il a besoin de boire, de manger, et il a besoin d'énergie, c'est tout à fait normal. Donc, je ne veux pas mettre en cause le concept lui-même, mais je veux m'assurer que ce concept n'exclut pas d'autres domaines d'activité de l'homme qui lui procurent des revenus, du travail, etc. Je prends juste pour illustrer, par exemple, la question quelques clarifications à ce sujet-là. Alors, je souhaite s'il n'y a pas d'objection, que je revienne un petit peu sur les deux interventions précédentes, parce que il me semble qu'on a souligné la complexité du sujet. La gestion de l'environnement avec les lois, avec les plans de développement, etc., c'est effectivement très, très complexe. Est-ce que l'espoir de la digitalisation, dans la numérisation, est-ce que pour vous, on peut espérer de ce côté-là mieux gérer la complexité de ce milieu? Alors, l'autre question, et ça, je me réfère un petit peu à la politique du Maroc, c'est la création des agences spécialisées dans un certain nombre de domaines. On vient d'ailleurs, on préconise, on va certainement le faire, créer une agence nationale de la gestion de l'eau. Mais on a déjà créé l'Agence nationale de la forêt, de la conservation de la forêt, de la gestion de la forêt. Il y a cette politique d'agence. Alors, moi, je voudrais, à votre avis et d'après votre expérience, quel est le moyen d'éviter que ces agences nous fassent tomber dans des politiques sectorielles limitées? Alors, je voudrais bien avoir votre avis par rapport à ça. Maintenant, les tribunaux, les lois, tout ça, je pense que c'est absolument indispensable. Et je pense qu'il faut trouver le moyen de renforcer cette politique-là en créant des tribunaux, en spécialisant du personnel, etc. Donc, je pense que ce sont des problèmes fondamentaux qui méritent d'être posés. Et je tiens très sincèrement à féliciter tous les intervenants pour les problèmes qu'ils ont évoqués, parce qu'il s'agit effectivement des problèmes de fond qui vont nous permettre de vivre mieux dans l'avenir. Je vous remercie.
Thank you, Mr. Benis. Madam Christina and Madam Jennifer, I have the pleasure to get a question for a Moroccan lady. She's within the room, Madam Miss Meryem. You have the floor. So now it's equitable because we have maybe one woman who is taking the floor.
Merci, Dr. Haddane. Tout d'abord, tous les participants et tous les intervenants aussi pour leurs interventions très riches et très abondantes en termes d'informations. Par ailleurs, j'aimerais juste poser une question qui est en rapport avec l'éducation au développement durable. Hassan de formation à l'environnement qui positionne la sensibilisation et l'éducation au développement durable dans le cœur de sa mission. Donc, ma question est comme la suite. D'après vous, c'est quoi le rôle que pourra jouer l'éducation au développement durable et la vulgarisation de tous ces concepts liés à la protection de l'eau autant qu'une richesse très importante, pas juste au niveau national, mais au niveau mondial, que ce soit dans les parties rurales ou aussi dans les parties loin. Merci.
Merci, mademoiselle Meryem. Je laisse la parole aux panélistes pour répondre. Si vous avez peut-être 5 minutes pour encore continuer la discussion.
Merci au président. Enfin, en ce qui me concerne, ce n'est pas directement une question qui m'a été adressée. Mais je peux essayer de dire un mot sur justement donc la dernière question, de dire la place donc de l'éducation dans ce processus. Donc c'est juste pour vous rappeler que pourquoi dans cette thématique particulière, moi j'ai décidé de parler donc de la Convention de Maputo, parce que la Convention de Maputo est une convention transversale qui aborde tous les sujets africains. Et donc justement cette convention accorde une place de choix à la recherche, comme toute autre convention d'ailleurs, et justement donc à l'éducation. Parce que justement donc la mise en œuvre donc de cette convention est aussi basée sur une connaissance donc approfondie donc de cette convention, mais sur justement donc l'initiative personnelle et l'initiative collective que chacun pourra prendre pour une meilleure mise en œuvre donc de cette convention. Donc voilà très rapidement ce que j'avais à dire sur cette question précise.
Merci, Dr. Yacouba. Je rappelle Monsieur Damilola pour répondre ou donner quelques éclaircissements.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I think those are, and I really appreciate the wonderful questions. First, on the issue of whether this whole water energy food nexus is different from some of the other iterations, like we have water, energy, and health, and the likes. And I think the issue is that for a while now, international law as a whole has recognized the increasing fragmentation of treaty systems. So whether you're talking of trade, environment, health, energy, there is a great realization, and we can trace that back to many years ago when the International Law Commission did an extensive study on this whole lack of regime interaction and fragmentation in international law. So since that study, and as a result of even some of the work by the International Law Association, since then, there's been different propositions, whether you call it water, energy, food nexus or water, health nexus, there's been different iterations. And what all these iterations are calling for is the need for regime interaction. They need to reduce the fragmentation in our efforts to address some of the problems facing the world. All proposals are also calling for the need for greater cooperation and harmonization, even by UN bodies and even African regional bodies. You see a situation whereby many of these institutional bodies are not, even able to share database or share information. There's almost like, treaty bodies springing up in different specialist areas. And then what you have is one system saying we need to address climate change, whereas another system, an international law, is you see implementation of projects that are violating human rights. So I think I would focus less on whether it is called water energy food nexus or water health nexus. The idea is essentially the same, which is need for greater harmonization. And on the second question, on how can we ensure that we do not exclude some domains if we focus, for example, on water, energy, and food and the likes. And I would say that the focus on water, energy, food nexus gained significant relevance when the World Economic Reports of 2011 and 2014 identified water, energy, and food as the key issues of the century, the key issues that, if addressed, might lead us to sustainable development. And you also have a National Intelligence Council of the United States report saying that water, energy, and food is going to be one of the 4 mega trends that will result in transformational global shifts by the year 2030. You also have the EU report specifically identifying water, energy, and food nexus as a key issue if we are going to address climate change. And why is this so? Why are these bodies emphasizing water, energy, food nexus? They are doing so because when you look at many countries, especially Africa, energy is the energy sector, the energy industries are some of the largest employers of labor. The energy sectors are so important that a collapse of the energy systems could result in significant problems. We all know, even apart from employment, lack of electricity is a key reason for the spread of disease in many parts of Africa. So there is a clear need to ensure that energy systems are protected from climate change. There is a clear need that for food systems to be protected from climate change, especially in arid African countries that are already suffering from either drought or the impact of climate change. And of course, there is a need to ensure water availability, affordability, and accessibility in many parts of Africa, especially when you look at many North African countries that are already suffering from water scarcities. So you will see that these 3 key sectors are central, and they have something to do with all other sectors, whether you're talking of education, labor. You cannot really talk about education without water, without energy, and without food. So I think when we talk about a water, energy, food nexus governance approach, it is just a reminder of 2 things. Number one, it's a reminder that there is a need for greater multi-stakeholder approaches or partnerships in addressing the problems of climate change and in looking at how we can ensure that climate change does not impact these 3 key sectors. Number 2, this governance approach is also looking at the need to ensure that solutions proposed at the international level do not address one problem by creating more problems. So you don't fight climate change by land grabs, or you don't fight climate change by creating, collapse in other systems. So I think those to me will be the 2 take-home messages and the things we need to probably keep in mind as we move forward in these treaty negotiations. Thank you very much.
Merci, professeur. Effectivement, le nexus eau, électricité, alimentation, c'est vraiment un complexe qui joue dans l'importance de la survie de l'humanité. Ils sont en concurrence et c'est très important. Moi, je vais donner la parole à Madame Christina et Madame Jennifer va conclure notre session. À vous, Madame Christina.
Thank you, and I'll be very brief, but I really appreciate that the questions, I'll just address 2. there was one question on the interlinkage between the complexity of addressing all these issues simultaneously and the potential that digitalization has in this context. And I think this is a really interesting aspect. When I'm thinking of what Damilola just described, the decarbonization of the energy sector, where basically many countries will have to leapfrog over fossil-based energy sources towards a much more diffuse energy system of renewable installation, be it wind or solar, on individual houses or villages. There's a huge potential for using digitalization in order to make the feed-in into the grid, for example, if there's a grid, more efficient. So there's a very interesting combination of using modern technology and renewable energy sources. That's just an example. And the second question from the lady in the room, I didn't catch her name, I'm very sorry, on education for sustainable energy. I think this is absolutely crucial, and education cannot be overemphasized on all levels, whether it's kindergarten, school, wherever, but also in law school curricula. And I know that from my own law school here in Norway, where we don't have a textbook on sustainable energy law. I'm currently writing one with 2 colleagues. And it's really fascinating because you have to go into all areas of law. It's not just environmental law. It is trade law, investment law, criminal law, company law, private contracts, what have you. In order to turn or transform to a sustainable society, you really have to get all different areas of law on board. And that takes us back to complexity, but we have to deal with that. And I guess we are used to it. And I just wanted to mention finally, also another work of the International Law Association, especially on principles for sustainable management and use of natural resources. This project, or this working program, was finalized this year with principles and declaration on sustainable use of natural resources. And I think it's available online, and it's a very important work, and you can draw inspiration for many legal fields from the International Law Association's work program.
Thanks.
Effectivement, l'éducation nous accompagne durant toute la vie, de la naissance jusqu'à la fin, parce qu'on apprend toujours, on est obligé d'apprendre, et on n'a jamais suffisamment de bagages de connaître, il faut toujours apprendre. Voilà, pour terminer cette session, je donne la parole à ma collègue Jennifer Mohamed pour conclure et résumer un peu cette séance que nous avons tenu, et je vous remercie aussi bien les intervenants que Madame Christina et tout le monde. Merci.
Thank you. So I'm not going to summarize the entire session, but I do want to point to some of the synergies between the papers. And, I think really when we started off with Christina, very useful reflections on the links between the different conventions at a global level, and really illustrating very nicely what the importance of these links from the perspective of our lived reality, not just from a sort of textbook approach to the law. Something that I had valued very much when I taught environmental law at the University of Zimbabwe many years ago. So I think this is a really important starting point. And then Yacouba brought us into the challenges we faced as a continent around actualizing our regional agreements, and took us through this very long history. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the key impediment there? Why is it that we lack the political will to make environmental law a reality? Why is it that our regional court system, despite important developments, has actually not been able to take these conventions and bring them to the disputes that are happening regionally in a way in which the national judicial systems can rely on? What we do see, of course, is that within the NGO sector, in the activist sectors, people are more able to rely on the judicial system. But we haven't seen that filter down within international courts. And I think Antonio had raised this much earlier, the importance of judicial training and education. And, I would really support Christina there that, yes, it's about the cross sections between the different categories of law, but also the links then between law and human rights and sustainable goal objectives as well. And then the final presentation by Damilola, sorry, Dami, is that he's given us so much food for thought about how we can begin to strengthen our national environmental law systems. Many of us have, many of our countries have environmental law systems that came out or developed in the mid-1990s in response to the Rio Conventions. But thinking and understanding since then, when we were focusing simply on sustainable development or sustainable use, has evolved so much. And the urgency around both the climate emergency and the biodiversity emergency, and critically important, the emergency we have in terms of the well-being of people in our continent, really puts us in this position where we have to go back to the drawing board and say, are our institutions and are our laws adequate? And I know, so there are many people in CEL, and I had seen Professor Robinson's face earlier. I just want to really also acknowledge him really as a pioneer in trying to make those links between international law and national law. And so part of the challenge to members of CEL who are in Africa is really for us to see how we can support each other in developing our environmental law systems in a way that takes into account these new nexus for development, and particularly the one that was highlighted today, energy, water, and food. Africa is strongly committed, our ministers are strongly committed to infrastructure development, strengthening the energy sector, and we have to ensure that this happens in a way that takes account of biodiversity, takes account of the overall well-being of the continent. And environmental law gives us a great starting point for pursuing that agenda. So that's my summary. It's not quite a summary, but I think these were really great papers. So thank you to all of you very much. And thank you to CEL also for this important work.